Okay, so you want to own a wedding venue. A business built around the single happiest day in most people's lives, where the product is not a service so much as a memory, where couples will plan for over a year, save for years before that, and pay you gladly, sometimes eagerly, for the privilege of getting married on your property. It sounds like one of the most emotionally bulletproof businesses on earth. People do not stop falling in love because of a recession. They do not cancel engagements because interest rates went up. Here is what nobody tells you. The demand is real. The romance of the business is real. The profit is a different story entirely, because a wedding venue is one of the strangest businesses in America. A business where your single most valuable piece of inventory is one specific Saturday. And if that Saturday passes empty, it is gone forever. Unsellable, unrecoverable, refundable to no one. By the end of this, you will understand exactly why an industry built on guaranteed love can still bankrupt an owner, and why the version of this business that fails almost never fails because people stopped getting married. Before we talk about money, we need to talk about what a wedding venue actually is, because that phrase covers several very different businesses standing under the same string of fairy lights. A full-service, all-inclusive venue handles the site, the tables and chairs, the catering, the bar, and often the coordinator, bundling almost everything a couple needs into one contract and one price. A bare venue rental strips nearly all of that away, selling only the space and a handful of hours, and requiring the couple to bring in every vendor themselves.
A converted barn or working farm sells rustic authenticity, the kind of property that looks free to maintain and is, in reality, one of the most expensive aesthetics in the industry once you account for the landscaping, the restoration, and the mud. And a historic estate or mansion sells prestige and photographs, charging a premium for a building that often comes with the strictest, most expensive preservation and insurance requirements of any venue type. These are not small differences. A barn wedding and a ballroom wedding can post the exact same site fee on their websites and run completely different cost structures behind the scenes. There is also a distinction almost nobody outside the industry thinks about, and it matters enormously. A wedding venue and the vendors who work inside it are two separate businesses that happen to need each other. The venue sells the space, the date, and the view. The caterer, the bar service, the florist, and the rental company sell everything that actually fills that space. Many of the most profitable venues in the country have spent the last decade trying to own both halves of that transaction, building an in-house kitchen, an in-house bar program, and an in-house rental inventory of chairs and linens, because a venue that captures the catering and the alcohol alongside the site fee can generate 2 to 3 times the revenue of a venue that simply rents out an empty room and lets outside vendors keep that margin for themselves. That single fact has quietly reshaped which venues thrive and which ones are treated as nothing more than a pretty backdrop. The first number that surprises people is what it costs just to open the gate. Total startup costs for a wedding venue typically run somewhere between $200,000 and over $1 million, depending on whether you are renovating an existing barn, restoring a historic property, or building new. One detailed financial model of a mid-size operation put the realistic total closer to $570,000 once you account for property renovation, equipment, and a cash reserve. And that number assumes you already own or have secured the land itself, which in many markets is the single biggest cost of all before a single hammer swings. Then comes the build-out that actually makes the property functional as a venue rather than just a nice piece of land. Parking that can handle 100 or more cars without turning into a muddy field. Restrooms, often a standalone structure because most residential-grade plumbing cannot handle a wedding's worth of guests at once. A backup power generator, because a blackout during a 400-person reception is not an inconvenience. It is a 5-star review that will follow you for years. If you plan to offer catering and bar service in-house rather than handing that revenue to a third party, add a full commercial kitchen, industrial ovens, walk-in refrigeration, and compliance-ready prep space, commonly priced around $75,000 on its own. Skip that kitchen build-out, and you are permanently capping your own revenue at the site fee alone, handing the highest margin part of every single wedding to someone else's business. And then there is the number almost nobody budgets correctly:
working capital. Because here is the part that catches new owners off guard. Weddings are booked 12 to 18 months in advance, which means a brand new venue can have a calendar full of bookings and almost no actual cash for an entire year, while renovations, licensing, insurance, and staff still need to be paid every single month regardless. Industry financial models commonly show a business needing to cover close to $100,000 in fixed annual overhead, insurance, software, base staffing, and property costs before a single wedding fee ever clears the bank. You are running a business that looks fully booked on paper, while your actual bank balance says otherwise, for months at a time. So how does a business like this actually make its money once the gate is open? This is where it gets interesting, because a wedding bill, just like a funeral bill, is rarely one price. It is a stack of separate charges. And understanding that stack explains almost everything about how this industry behaves. The first layer is the site fee itself, the base cost simply to use the space for a fixed number of hours. Nationally, couples spend an average of somewhere around $12,000 on the venue alone, and that single line item now represents over 30% of the average total wedding budget. In premium markets, a single Saturday's site fee alone can run $25,000 or more before a single chair is rented. The second layer is catering and bar service, and just like the casket in a funeral home, this is where the real markup lives. Many venues require couples to use an in-house caterer or a short list of approved vendors, and industry data consistently shows food and beverage carrying some of the highest margins of the entire event, often marked up well beyond what the same meal would cost prepared independently. Outside alcohol is frequently banned outright or allowed only with a steep corkage fee attached, quietly functioning the same way a casket handling fee once did. A charge that exists specifically to discourage a cheaper outside option, whether or not it is framed that way in the contract. The third layer is what the industry politely calls add-ons, and it is where a modest site fee quietly becomes a five-figure invoice. Extra hours for setup or teardown, a getting-ready suite for the morning of, string lighting, a dance floor, a ceremony arch, heaters for an outdoor reception that runs past sunset. Each one individually sounds reasonable. Stacked together across a single wedding, they routinely add several $1,000s to a bill that started out sounding almost affordable on the venue's website. The fourth layer is the one that keeps this industry stable, and it is structurally almost identical to a funeral home's pre-need contract. It is the deposit. A couple pays today, often 50% of the total contract or more, to lock in a date that will not happen for a year or 18 months. On paper, this is a beautiful piece of business. It locks in future revenue immediately. It lets a venue plan staffing and cash flow around a booked calendar, and it protects the venue from a couple simply walking away. But here is the difference that makes this version of the arrangement far more dangerous than its funeral industry cousin. A funeral home's pre-need money is required by state law to sit untouched in a trust or insurance policy until it is needed. A wedding venue's deposit, in the overwhelming majority of states, is not. It simply lands in the business's operating account on the same day, with no legal requirement that it still exist 12 months later when the couple actually shows up. The fifth layer is pricing itself, and it is where the industry's biggest structural pressure is starting to show. Peak Saturdays in June and October can command a premium 2 to 3 times higher than a Tuesday in February, and a growing share of couples are chasing that gap. Weekday weddings now account for roughly 1 in 5 weddings nationally, specifically because of the discount attached. At the same time, a wedding trend the industry did not see coming a decade ago has taken hold. Micro-weddings, with a third of couples now planning events under 50 guests, and, more strikingly, nearly half of couples marrying in 2025 skipping the reception entirely. A venue's fixed costs, the mortgage or lease on the land, the landscaping crew keeping the grounds photogenic, the staff, the insurance, do not shrink just because the average booking is now worth a fraction of what it used to be. There is a sixth pressure most owners never see coming until it is already too late, and it lives inside that same deposit structure. Because state law does not require the money to sit anywhere specific, the only thing standing between a couple's deposit and a business's unrelated expenses is the owner's own discipline, and sometimes the owner's own desperation. Wedding insurance exists specifically to cover this exact scenario: a venue closing its doors, a vendor disappearing, a date lost entirely with nothing to show for the money already spent. It typically costs a few $100s against a wedding now averaging well over $30,000. And yet industry surveys consistently find that only a small minority of couples ever actually buy it, because nobody planning the happiest day of their life budgets for the possibility that the building itself might not be there when the day arrives. In North Carolina, a venue called Champaign Manor built exactly that kind of reputation, marketing glamorous, all-inclusive wedding packages that required couples to pay up front for the caterer, the photographer, the florist, and the hair and makeup team, all bundled through the venue itself. Between October of 2023 and January of 2025, the venue's owner also solicited outside investors, promising ownership stakes and guaranteed returns in exchange for cash. In the middle of 2024, the property defaulted on its mortgage, and foreclosure proceedings quietly began. The owner kept booking weddings anyway, and kept collecting deposits and vendor payments from couples who had no idea the building they were planning to marry in was already being taken away from him. When the venue abruptly closed in January of 2025, dozens of couples discovered the news the same way. A notification, sometimes only months before their wedding date, that the place they had saved for years to afford no longer existed as a business. Prosecutors eventually calculated the scheme at more than $1 million taken from customers and investors combined. One Myrtle Beach couple alone lost close to $20,000, money they had specifically set aside for their wedding and nothing else. The owner pleaded guilty to federal wire fraud in the middle of 2026, facing a maximum sentence of 20 years. This was not an isolated case. A Brooklyn catering hall called Rebar closed just as abruptly years earlier, leaving more than 100 couples without a venue and without their deposits, some of which ran as high as $18,000 to $20,000 per couple, while its owner was separately convicted of skimming over $1 million in sales tax from the business. A historic mansion venue in upstate New York faced a 23-count indictment, including enterprise corruption charges, after regulators traced a pattern of wedding deposits that never made it back to couples once the venue stopped operating during a prolonged closure. Different states, different owners, different decades, the same underlying mechanism every time. Money paid today for a service that will not be delivered for a year or more, sitting in an account with no legal wall around it, waiting for the day someone in financial trouble decides it is easier to spend than to protect. A different kind of trust failure, and a much stranger one, shows up when you look at what happens on the operational side of this business, rather than the financial side. In March of 2026, at a 26-acre estate venue called the Preserve at Chicoria in Tamworth, New Hampshire, a wedding ceremony was just beginning inside a building on the property known as the Sap House. 144 guests were packed inside. Without warning, the floor gave way. Nearly 70 people, about half the room, fell roughly 8 feet through a 20 by 20-foot opening into the basement below, some of them landing among farm equipment stored down there for the winter. 6 people were taken to the hospital. Investigators later determined the building had likely been over its safe capacity at the moment the floor collapsed. What makes this case so unsettling is not the accident itself, but the gap it exposed.
The building predated the state's modern construction code, which meant its structural load-bearing capacity had never been formally evaluated the way a newly built venue's would be. Meanwhile, the fire code did assign the space an occupant load, a number meant to ensure people could safely exit in an emergency. Investigators pointed out that these are 2 entirely different measurements, calculated for 2 entirely different purposes, and that a room can be perfectly compliant on paper for how many people can get out of it, while nobody has ever formally checked whether the floor underneath those same people can actually hold their weight in the first place. Put those 2 stories side by side, and a pattern emerges that has nothing to do with either owner's individual character or either building's individual history. 1 collapsed the financial side of trust, a deposit paid today for a wedding that would not happen for a year, sitting in an account nobody was required to protect.
The other collapsed the structural side of trust. A floor assumed for generations to be capable of holding a room full of people because nobody had ever actually been required to check. Neither failure required a uniquely broken business. Both simply required nobody checking for long enough at exactly the 2 points in this industry where the customer has no way to check for themselves. A year before their wedding day, when all they can do is trust a contract, and on the day itself, when all they can do is trust the floor. Against that backdrop, the wedding venue industry remains one of the most fragmented businesses in American real estate, and understanding why explains where the real opportunity has been sitting in plain sight. Small, independently owned businesses still make up roughly 9 in 10 wedding vendors nationally, and the overwhelming majority of venues remain single property operations owned by one family or one couple.
Analysts have openly pointed to this fragmentation, along with what one report called the industry's oddly emotional customer dynamics, as the exact reason large investors have historically stayed away. Only one operator has scaled to anything resembling a national platform. Wedgwood Weddings now runs more than 75 exclusive venues across 8 states, hosting upward of 11,000 weddings a year with roughly 2,000 employees, after a Chicago private equity firm recapitalized the company in 2014 and used it to quadruple its venue count, largely by acquiring distressed properties at a discount. That platform was itself sold to a new ownership group in the middle of 2025, the kind of exit private equity is built around.
Everyone else in this industry is still, functionally, a mom-and-pop operation competing against a scale that barely exists yet, which means the roll-up that reshaped funeral homes, dental practices, and veterinary clinics over the last 2 decades has, in wedding venues, barely even started. Now let's put real numbers against 2 versions of the same wedding venue, because this is where the honest math either supports the romance of this business or quietly undermines it. In the optimistic scenario, a mid-size venue booking somewhere around 40 to 50 weddings a year, charging an average site fee in the $12,000 to $15,000 range, and capturing catering and bar revenue in-house rather than handing it to outside vendors, can generate annual revenue well into 7 figures. Industry benchmarks for venues that successfully bundle food and beverage alongside the site fee place total revenue anywhere from $700,000 to nearly $3 million a year, with net margins in the 20 to 30% range that sit near the top of the entire events industry. A healthy deposit calendar means the owner can see 18 months of bookings ahead of time, planning staffing and cash flow with a level of predictability few small businesses ever get to enjoy. In the realistic, difficult year, several ordinary pressures compound at once. The area's newest couples are chasing the micro-wedding trend, and a growing share of them are skipping the sit-down reception entirely, which quietly removes the highest margin part of the day, the catered dinner and open bar, from a large share of your bookings. More couples are booking weekday dates specifically to capture the discount, which fills your calendar on paper while your average revenue per event keeps drifting lower. A national operator, or simply a better capitalized independent competitor with a real in-house culinary program, opens 45 minutes away and starts pulling premium Saturday bookings that used to be automatic. Your fixed costs, the mortgage or lease, the landscaping crew keeping the grounds camera ready, the insurance premium that rises every year regardless of your claims history, do not move an inch. Under those conditions, a venue can watch its net margin compress by a third or more in a single season, even while its calendar looks just as full as it did the year before. Because in this business, occupancy was never really the number that mattered. The average value of what fills each date was, and that number has been quietly eroding for the venues that never built the in-house revenue streams to protect themselves from it. So does owning a wedding venue actually work as a business? The honest answer is that it works extremely well for the people who understand it is not really a service business selling a couple's happiest day. It is a fixed-cost real estate operation selling a single, irreplaceable date, in an industry where the deposit that funds nearly everything else carries none of the legal protection that a decades-long financial scandal eventually forced onto its closest cousin in the funeral business. The guaranteed demand was never the hard part.
People will keep falling in love and keep wanting somewhere beautiful to stand while they promise each other forever, reliably, every single June in every single town. The hard part was building a business that survives the fact that its single most valuable piece of inventory, one specific Saturday, either gets filled or disappears forever the moment the sun sets on it. And building a level of trust sturdy enough to hold both a family's entire life savings and, on the day itself, quite literally, their weight.